Hello, it's Joe Simhart here in number 14 in the series Cults and All Culture. This is a follow-up on my number 13 video regarding enlightenment and its banality. So the title of this talk, referencing Jesus, who was born again or resurrected to the Father in the story of the gospel, we're going to talk about the banality of the born-again experience. This idea of born-again has been formalized basically in the 20th century, and maybe in the 19th through the Great Awakenings among Christians. And the idea of born-again got to be equated with being saved. And it also seemed to be equated with a type of knowledge or gnosis that you're saved based on a particular reading of the gospel. And along with that, there's kind of an experience of salvation. So what does being saved mean? Is it being saved by something? And what are you born again into? What does this mean? Are we saved by some powerful God, like a sorcerer in the sky that waves his magic wand of grace over us, and we realize that we are one with this God, or that we should come to this God in some future time? Or is this some kind of a personal experience, what we might call spiritual awakening? Let's say we go to a Christian gathering. It's the first time we've done this. We're not really Christian. And suddenly we feel quickened, and there are people speaking in tongues around us. And we suddenly start, what they call glossolalia, and we feel infused with angelic fervor and the Holy Spirit, and we have quite an experience. I went to one of these large Christian gatherings in New Mexico at Glorieta one time over a weekend with men. It was all men. And they were Protestant, somewhat charismatic. And I was at their final day when the preacher was getting people warmed up with music and rousing them with thoughts of glory and God and the Holy Spirit. And during the session, suddenly men in the audience would begin standing up and speaking in tongues, with their hands raised in the air. And then some would gather in groups and pray over people, seeking prophecy, seeking to infuse them with the Holy Spirit. And lo and behold, a group of men wrapped around me, 4 or 5 of them with their hands on me, with their heads bowed down, praying, and I got the impression that they wanted me to get the Holy Spirit and begin speaking in tongues, and I was feeling kind of uncomfortable, so I started speaking or praying in Hungarian. Édes Jézuskám, segíts meg, légy velem, amen. Édes Jézuskám, segíts meg. Okay, now, unless you're Hungarian, you don't understand what I'm saying. But it was the first prayer I ever learned as a kid when I was little. And they released. They felt that I got it, whatever that is, the experience of the Holy Spirit. So, by that time in my career with understanding cults and group influence, I wasn't about to fall into this trance trap of abiding with the idea of speaking in tongues. Now, don't get me wrong, the men around me were good men. They were there for a good reason. They wanted to invest themselves in deeper spirituality so that they could be better husbands, better citizens, and so forth. But this idea of being born again is also available in a different way in Hindu culture. There's the whole idea of caste, and the upper castes are considered twice born. So they are dead to this world of Maya, and or they die to it, and they are born again into the awareness of being one with Brahman, and the high determination of God in the Hindu mythology. They go through a ceremony and get a string around them as Brahmins to indicate that they have become twice born. But back to the Christian idea, I.M. Lewis in his book Ecstatic Religion, and he's basically talking about shamanism here, but it applies to the Christian experience as well. And he says that aspects of the psychedelic litany, he's talking about this turn on, tune in, and drop out idea, asserts the primacy of mystical experience and proclaims the widely held view that every transcendent encounter is unique and can be apprehended only by direct personal experience. So direct personal experience of Jesus, having him come into your heart, is part of the born-again experience. At an individual level, this, of course, is always true, he says, but it does not alter the fact that mystical experience, like any other experience, is grounded in and must relate to the social environment in which it is achieved. It thus inevitably bears the stamp of the culture and society in which it arises. So if you happen to have a God experience within a Christian milieu, be it a local church in Kentucky or a Catholic church in Paris or wherever, that environment will infuse your experience and you'll tend to bond with that particular environment. If you happen to have an ecstatic experience in a satanic church, you'll bond with that because the experience itself feels like gnosis. It's ineffable, it's penetrating, it's transcendent, and all of these things, and all these experiences come from it. But we can have this born-again experience and things can change. Our lives can change dramatically. For instance, this person that was born again into a fundamentalist faith, David Curie, he grows up and he finally decides, after experiencing a change in orientation to the gospel, he becomes a Catholic. And so he wrote this book, Born Fundamentalist, Born Again Catholic. And he has a very convincing explanation for why that happened to him. But more often than not, the reason I call it banal is that it's no big deal if the conduct and the governance within the situation that you're born again into is healthy and ethical and has a good moral grounding. Lots of authors have written about this problem of people becoming born again and ending up in abusive churches. One of the best I found is called The Subtle Power of Spiritual Abuse, Recognizing and Escaping Spiritual Manipulation and a False Spiritual Authority Within the Church, by David Johnson and Van Vonderen. So these authors look very deeply into this problem of what can happen once someone's born again or feels that they are, and how that's easily manipulated by managers of the particular environment they're in. And they can become what's called damaged disciples, and this is written by Ron and Vicki Burks. It's subtitled Casualties of Authoritarian Churches and the Shepherding Movement. One of the shepherding movements was called the Boston Church. Another one, these Campus Crusade and others that manipulate people. This book by, interesting book edited by Flavil Yeakley Jr., is called The Discipling Dilemma, a study of the discipling movement among the churches of Christ. But he looks at what happens, and what happens with people. They go into the born-again experience, into a particular church, and if it's a very manipulative church, you will find that the person changes because you're supposed to change. You're supposed to have Christ infused in you, and Christ changes you. But what happens in the discipling churches and some of these shepherding movements is you become more like the personality of the church, and you lose your own personality. And in fact, you have to repress your personality very often. If like you're a free creative spirit, you no longer will be. You'll become more like the people in that particular group, dressing like them, talking like them, running your life like them, going to meetings as they request. Always calling your discipler or your elder to find out how to interpret things, or whether you should buy a house, or problems with your wife and all that kind of thing. So that the church that you're adapted to in that sense could become very abusive in its authoritarian measures over your life. So basically it comes back to the same thing that I talked about in the last talk on enlightenment and its banality is, we have problems of knowledge, problems of conduct, and problems of governance. The knowledge that we're one with God, or that we're born again and that we're saved, whatever that means, is not really any big deal if your conduct is not wonderful, and if your governance is contained within some cultic milieu that's highly authoritarian and potentially abusive. Anyway, thank you for listening, and we'll go to number 15 next.